When people talk about Shangguan Wan'er, the labels they reach for are usually the same: a talented woman, a tragic figure, a victim of Li Longji's coup. But once a political figure is reduced to nothing more than those few labels, that usually means we are no longer trying to understand her. We are letting a stereotype do the thinking for us. Because if Shangguan Wan'er had only been a gifted woman, she could not have remained in that position for so long during Wu Zetian's later years and under Emperor Zhongzong. The historical record says that she possessed literary talent and was well-versed in administrative affairs. It also says that from Wu Zetian's later years onward, memorials from various offices were often submitted to her for deliberation, and that under Zhongzong, she came to take charge of imperial edicts. Put together, these records make the conclusion quite clear. She was not simply a woman who could write poetry. She was someone who entered the handling of government affairs, participated in decisions, and drafted the formal language of imperial power. So I think the real thing that needs to change in how we talk about Shangguan Wan'er is not whether she had talent. Of course she did. The problem is that we keep understanding her talent in overly literary terms. Talent matters, but politics is not a poetry contest. Politics does not place someone in a crucial position just because they write beautifully. To be used by politics over a long period of time, what matters is not literary brilliance alone, but the ability to turn literary skill into political function. And I will go even further than that. What is most worth discussing about Shangguan Wan'er is not simply that she wrote well. It is that she was doing a much more sophisticated kind of work. As I said in the previous video, she was a mediator inside the political world. And by mediator, I do not mean some vague figure standing in the middle. I mean that she stood between systems that did not naturally connect to one another, translating, coordinating, and converting between them so that they could continue to function. First, she was a mediator between the emperor and the bureaucratic machine. An imperial edict was not a literary work, it was the final form of political intent. The emperor's will could not remain at the level of, "This is roughly what I want." It had to be turned into formal language that could be issued, carried out, understood by officials, and at the same time not immediately provoke resistance. Shangguan Wan'er's long-standing role in drafting imperial documents and reviewing memorials shows that what she was doing was not decorative writing. She was turning supreme power into workable text. She had to know what could be said and what could not, what needed to be stated clearly and what needed to be left open, what counted as a declaration, what counted as a probe, what was meant to reassure and what was meant to pressure. That kind of ability goes far beyond the label of a talented woman. It was a form of political language. She was also a mediator between the inner court and the outer court. In Tang politics, the inner court was not simply a domestic or private space. It was closely tied to the making of political decisions. Based on recent studies and the evidence of her epitaph, Wu Zetian had women with literary ability recruited and trained inside the palace to take on a large share of inner court writing and administrative work. Shangguan Wan'er later took over that burden of drafting documents and gradually became the central figure within this group of women officials. In other words, she was not simply someone Wu Zetian happened to notice and keep nearby to write a few pieces. She occupied a position that had real function within the workings of inner court politics. She took intentions, judgments, and arrangements formed inside the palace and turned them into commands and signals that could be released to the outer court. At the same time, she also had to absorb memorials and information coming from the various offices and from the bureaucratic system. She was transmitting outward, but also filtering inward. And beyond that, she also played a mediating role between rival political factions. This is especially easy to overlook because the moment people see court politics, they tend to reduce everything to one phrase, picking sides. As if historical figures simply went to work every day to choose a camp, clock in, betray someone, and then wait to be eliminated. But Shangguan Wan'er was not that simple. Based on her epitaph and related scholarship, from Wu Zetian's later years to the period around the Shenlong coup, Wan'er was not merely attached to one side. She was closely connected to Princess Taiping and also played a supporting role during the coup itself. Then, under Zhongzong, she found herself moving within a field of rivalry involving Empress Wei, Princess Enle, Princess Taiping, and the faction around the Prince of Xiang. So her importance was not simply a matter of which side she belonged to. What made her important was that she could rearrange language, relationships, and political options between these competing forces, allowing the situation to remain workable, at least for a time. So if I had to give her a more precise identity, I would put it this way. She was not a talented woman dragged into politics. She was a converter inside the machinery of politics itself. So what exactly do I mean by calling her a converter? I think we can understand it on at least 3 levels. The first was the conversion of emotion into institutional language. The emperor, the woman of the inner court, members of the imperial clan, powerful ministers, their intentions were not always clear or fully formed. In many cases, what existed at the top was only an attitude, a preference, a burst of anger, a private concern, or even just a vague direction. But the state cannot run on vague attitudes. It has to be written down. And what made Shangguan Wan'er so important was that she could turn those elite intentions into language that could enter the machinery of government. The second was compressing conflict between different political groups into a form they could still live with, at least temporarily. Mediation does not necessarily mean resolving conflict, and it certainly does not mean she was some kind of peacemaker. In many cases, mediation simply means finding a formula that everyone can still live with before the conflict fully explodes. After Emperor Zhongzong's death, for example, the testamentary edict drafted by Shangguan Wan'er and Princess Taiping attempted to create a temporary framework in which multiple forces could coexist. The Prince of Wen would be enthroned, Empress Wei would rule from behind the curtain, and the Prince of Xiang would assist in government. That arrangement was later altered by Zhong Chuke and others, and the situation quickly spiraled out of control. But that is precisely the point. What Wan'er had originally been doing was a form of political mediation, not a total commitment to one side, but an attempt to leave room for succession, balance, and restraint. The third was converting cultural resources into political resources. During Zhongzong's reign, Shangguan Wan'er not only remained in charge of imperial drafting, but also exercised clear influence in the literary world. Historical accounts and later scholarship both note that she promoted literary institutions, recommended scholars, and helped create a situation in which many literary officials gathered around her. This should not be reduced to a simple love of literature. More accurately, she was organizing writers, writing, reputation, and court culture into a form of political capital. She was both a writer and a selector, both a judge of literary culture and an interface for court discourse. In that sense, she brought the cultural sphere into the center of power. And once you look back at the label talented woman, its problem becomes much clearer. It sounds like praise, but in many cases, it is actually a way of making her smaller. It takes someone who carried real political function and places her back inside a safe, soft, literary box. As if her value lay mainly in writing well, composing elegantly, showing literary grace, and suffering a pitiable fate. But the truly dangerous and truly important part of Shangguan Wan'er was not there. The real Shangguan Wan'er was someone who understood government affairs, understood power, understood the limits of expression, and understood how different forces could be made to coexist, at least for a time. The historical record says she was well versed in administrative affairs. Those 4 words carry far more weight than the label talented woman. A comparison with Li Bai makes the point even clearer. Li Bai's literary achievement far surpassed Shangguan Wan'er's, but his experience at court proves something important. A great poet is not necessarily a political talent who can be used steadily over time. So the difference between Li Bai and Shangguan Wan'er was not simply who had more talent. It was whose talent could be continuously absorbed by the political system. So we should stop understanding Shangguan Wan'er simply as a tragic, talented woman. That kind of reading may invite sympathy, but it also does the most to flatten her real political character. What was truly remarkable about her was not just what she wrote, but how she turned her talent into a political instrument power could actually use. How she made herself into a figure with real political function in her own time. She was ultimately killed in the political purge led by Li Longji, not because she was merely an unfortunate woman, but because, as an important mediator still linking the old order together, she no longer fit the new political structure. So, with a figure like Shangguan Wan'er, a literary perspective can certainly be useful as a supplement, but it cannot replace a structural view of power. Because once we begin from the literary angle, she is too easily reduced to talent, fate, emotion, and tragedy, while her function, position, and role within the power structure fade into the background. The most important work of her life was not any single poem. It was the way she turned herself into someone politics could continue to use.